The premise of this series is that our inability to actually know anything about God's existence, character, or will make God, even if God exists, absolutely irrelevant to our daily lives. I've called myself an apatheist, but I've also referred to myself as a practical atheist, because without any real knowledge of God's existence or character or will, there just isn't any practical reason for me or anyone to care. There may be alien races of sentient beings in distant galaxies, or some species of furry humanoid living in the mountains. But without any direct knowledge of these beings, what exactly are we supposed to do? Does the possibility of Bigfoot's existence have any practical bearing on your life? Of course not. In many fields of study, we're taught to move from the general to the specific, as a way of not putting the cart before the horse. But in religion, people will talk with unrivaled conviction about the will and character of God, the specifics, when they can't even demonstrate God's existence, the general. As I've said before, this is like talking about fairies preferring ranch on their salads rather than Thousand Island. Theists themselves will acknowledge this when suggesting that it's silly to argue over how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, not realizing that literally everything to do with God should be put in that same category. You see, even in science, we don't have any certain knowledge. We don't really know anything, but rather have a provisional understanding. That provisional understanding, however, is demonstrable, repeatable, and actionable. Lacking such knowledge of the deity makes God, practically speaking, irrelevant. Practical atheism also refers to the kind and quality of knowledge we would need to make God a relevant or practical concern in our lives. I've asked, what can we know about God in terms of demonstrable, repeatable, actionable knowledge? Let me clarify what I'm talking about. Demonstrable knowledge, as I'm using it, is knowledge that is open and available to anyone and everyone. It is in no way dependent on what you believe, who you are, or your standing in any given organization. It is in no way exclusive, and it can be shared with and demonstrated to anyone. Repeatable knowledge means that the knowledge is reliable, and given the same set of circumstances, will give you or anyone else the same results whenever and wherever. Demonstrable, repeatable knowledge allows others to confirm the knowledge, leading to, and this is where the practical part comes in, actionable knowledge, which means that the knowledge is certain enough to allow the knower to make predictions regarding causal relationships to the point where we can act on that knowledge with highly predictable results. When we have demonstrable, repeatable, actionable knowledge, human beings are able to accomplish some truly amazing things, even to the point where we can risk our own lives and/or the lives of others in order to achieve a goal, because our knowledge is so complete and predictable that the risk is negligible. You experience this every time you board an airplane and fly across the country. It's how we've put men on the moon, landed a probe on a comet, or cured disease. This is exactly the kind and quality of knowledge we are lacking from religion and religious leaders. Of course, many religious people will gladly admit to not having this kind of knowledge, arguing that this is exactly where faith comes in. Faith being the antidote to this kind of knowledge deficit. But the problem of knowledge doesn't go away by appealing to faith. How exactly does one know what to have faith in? This is as much a knowledge question as any other, and according to some religions, the stakes couldn't be higher, as having the wrong faith could lead, according to some believers, to an eternity of torture. With more than 500 world religions, nearly 1,000 variations of Christianity, and the myriad of fallen gods throughout history, Osiris, Zeus, Todd, the odds of anyone being born into the one true religion are astronomically small. In fact, it's entirely possible that the one true religion, even if God does exist, is not even being practiced today. Remember, modern humans had been walking the planet for 150,000 years without access to the one true faith before God finally decided to speak to Moses. But let's stop for a moment and consider just how much faith is required specifically. Let's look at everything for which we're lacking demonstrable, repeatable, actionable knowledge regarding the God of Abraham. First, let's remember that the Kalam argument gets you only to a deist God, which is irrelevant to our lives. So you have to have faith because we are lacking knowledge that this cause is a personal being. Then you have to have faith that this personal being is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-good, cares about us, and that this personal being somehow exists in no material way and entirely outside time. Yet despite being outside time, this being was able to cause our universe to exist, which required God to act, which of course requires time. Then regarding God's character and will, you have to have faith, again because we're lacking knowledge, that this personal, immaterial being who exists outside time interacted with humans in time. That humans properly interpreted that interaction and then communicated that interaction correctly. Then you have to have faith that generation after generation after generation orally transmitted that interaction accurately before it was written down. And finally, you have to have faith that those writings from which we get our various translations were copied and translated accurately, as the original written copies do not exist for us to examine. With all that faith, there's one last decision. Which version of the God of Abraham will you choose? The original, Judaism, or Christianity or Islam, both of which add a whole host of additional claims for which you will need additional faith. After all that, how is anyone to know which God to put their faith in? Well, luckily for the religious, and against all odds, every single person in whatever faith, all of them won the theological lottery and just happened to be born into the one true religion. Of course, that can't possibly be true, right? Or could it? There's actually a component of faith in the God of Abraham in particular that really does make such a thing possible. To acquire actionable knowledge, we have over the centuries figured out that one of the most efficient and reliable methods is to test a belief or claim in a way that would falsify it, where failure to pass a given test would reveal the claim to be a false claim. If we do this enough, we whittle away at the various possibilities until what we're left with is the statistically probable. And frequently, that statistically probable result gets us close enough that we acquire some actionable knowledge. For instance, if I claim that all cats are black, the claim is easily falsified by the existence of a white cat. Of course, that's a very simplified version of the falsification principle, but that really is the gist of it. We know much of what we know because we've been able to systematically rule out false possibilities. But what if that were not the case? What if nothing were falsifiable and all possibilities remained as potentially true as any other? I want you to think about that for a moment. Could we know anything with any confidence? The supernatural. Well, that's exactly what religious people believe. They believe in the supernatural, and that God is a supernatural being for whom the limitations and workings of our universe simply don't apply. With God, all things are possible. In Isaiah, God puts it this way: "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways." This makes it absolutely impossible to know anything about God, even if God exists. Because however unlikely or improbable something might be, with God, it's absolutely possible and cannot be ruled out. Which means that nothing is improbable, no matter how irrational or immoral. It's a miracle! This is how religious apologists like William Lane Craig can defend things like genocide, including the murder of babies whom Craig says were the recipients of an infinite good. Now, if you're like me or any other sane person who just can't see the murder of babies as an infinite good, Craig says it's because you're looking at things from a naturalistic perspective. You see, if you'll just allow for the supernatural, this mystical, magical world where anything is possible, you'll see that the murder of infants and children, however immoral it seems to us, can be a good thing. It's a miracle! Because in Craig's supernatural worldview, those babies went right to heaven, where they eat lollipops and cotton candy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. They get to ride their ponies and their triceratops until nap time, where they'll rest peacefully in the arms of Jesus, who will clean their little bums with the wings of angels. It's a miracle! Religious people have often told me that these stories, like the genocide in Canaan or the demand that Abraham kill his son Isaac, are God's way of testing our faith. But I think they're God's way of testing our intelligence, because what these people don't realize is that they're dealing with a double-edged sword, and even more so in the Abrahamic faiths, where God is confronted by the loyal opposition, another supernatural being named Satan. In almost every debate, William Lane Craig provides a list of reasons why he thinks the resurrection of Jesus really did happen. He presents this list as evidence of God's existence and Jesus' divinity. Rather than argue with Dr. Craig's list, let's just grant him everything and accept for the purposes of this argument that everything about the life of Jesus, as documented in the Gospels, is true. Let's accept that Jesus rose from the dead and ascended skyward right up through the atmosphere. The problem is, even if all of that is true, how does any believer, including Dr. Craig, know that Jesus wasn't risen from the dead by Satan? How does one know that this other nefarious supernatural actor wasn't at play in order to send the world into the Dark Ages and inspire nearly 2,000 years of war, ignorance, and ultimately Reaganomics? How? Now, before you answer, I want to warn you, don't you dare try to use reason on me. You see, reason is the hobgoblin of people like me, who look at things from a naturalistic perspective. If you've embraced the supernatural and all the insanity that comes with that, you can't just open a giant box of irrationality and then ask reason to help you get the damn thing closed again. Reason only works in the realm of causal predictability. You're talking about beings who exist immaterially and outside time, where causal predictability has no sway. Even if it did, how do you know that Christianity isn't just God's latest little test of faith, a 2,000-year experiment to see if we'd embrace the irrational in order to soothe our existential angst? Remember, 2,000 years for God is like that. I know this is an unpleasant thought, but the mystical and the magical can't be applied only to things we want to be true, can it? Or are you really willing to stack the deck that much in your favor? Well, of course. That's exactly what the religious have done, and yet, in so doing, they reveal their own hypocrisy, as when confronted with opposition, this is exactly the kind of thing that they'll say has happened to everyone else. If you don't believe as the religious do, you have probably been tricked by the devil. There's no possibility that they've been tricked, of course not. But you, definitely. I can't tell you how many times I heard this from Christians when I was a Mormon. Hell, I'm still hearing it as an atheist. But virtually every religion believes to some extent that all the other religions are tools of the Dark Lord, who seeks to muddy the waters and keep people from the one true religion. Some creationists believe that Satan is behind evolution. Some Christians believe that Satan is the God of Islam. And virtually every Mormon on earth believes that Satan is my BFF. Dr. Craig himself has an entire section on his website, unironically and oxymoronically called Reasonable Faith, where he writes almost endlessly about Satan and his minions. He seems to know everything about them, though he can't even prove they exist. Ranch, not Thousand Island, right? Speaking of Satan and his Wu-Tang, Craig writes, "We looked at their work, talking about how they try to destroy the servants of God, blinding unbelievers' eyes to the gospel and seeking to nullify the preaching of the kingdom of God." But how does Dr. Craig know that Satan hasn't deceived him? In fact, since Craig has accepted this supernatural realm where powerful, wicked, immaterial beings who live outside time and therefore are not subject to the causal predictability of reason, how does Craig claim to know anything? When all things are possible, nothing is any more improbable than anything else, and wicked supernatural beings exist solely for the purpose of deceiving us. Given those parameters, how does anyone claim to know anything? Even Pascal's wager, an insurance policy for believers, doesn't make sense once you've allowed the supernatural. Believing in God because it's a safe bet may be the one thing that God hates more than anything else. Cowardice is repulsive to me. Why not God? For the last 400 years, science has been pursuing the kind of practical, useful, actionable knowledge about this world in order to make this realm a better place for us to live. And the fact that anyone can test this knowledge, it being open to everyone, has given our species a way to answer questions about our world and who we are in a way that resolves conflict without the need for bloodshed. We simply look at the evidence. That also allows us to look at those who think differently without the need to demonize or view others as pathetic dupes who have been deceived by Satan and his minions. Of course, believers will tell you that they couldn't possibly be the ones who've been deceived. Why not? Well, because they have a book, and that book contains the Word of God Himself. That's what we'll be looking at next time on The God Distraction. I hope you'll join me, and thanks again for watching. It's a miracle!